Well, welcome to Education for Life. This is your free webinar series that we're doing just with overcoming anxiety. And really excited to have you here. Welcome. And we're going to spend a few minutes, so probably put aside 20 to 30 minutes. Close the door, turn off your social media, and really wanting you to pay attention to what we're talking about today, because some of this information really might change your life, and in particular when it comes to anxiety. We've been doing psychology for many, many years. As a picture of myself. I'm a psychologist, and I've been doing psychology for probably about 10 years in private practice. But overall worked in lots of different sectors in life, like corporate sector. So I've worked for Microsoft, IBM, a lot of high-end software kind of companies. And that's all the way from, customer service to account management to a whole bunch of areas there in that 10 years period. Also worked in the community sector in Australia, in particular in the Queensland, which is sort of northeastern Australia, and sort of ended up working in Department of Communities, which very much looks after child safety, and looks after safety within a family environment. So lots of different experiences there. But also the last 10 years been working in private practice as a psychologist, and very much the heartbeat behind Education for Life as a whole. And we've got many courses that we're putting out, is really taking some of the education that we've learnt and the information that we've learned as psychologists across that 10-year period plus, and those face-to-face appointments I've written down. We've done over 10,000 hours of face-to-face appointments in psychology. And so we wanted to put together information from all of these different areas just to kind of fast-track what happens in a session. And we find ourselves as psychologists repeating information regularly. And what we wanted to do is just sort of really fast track that information so you can get the best of what happens in a session, and really apply it to your life as soon as you can, and sort of get the benefits from that. So today's webinar is all about anxiety, and we're going to specifically talk about anxiety because it is really one of the most common sort of areas that we find in private practice. And so what we're going to talk about is what is anxiety, what's actually anxiety itself, what do the symptoms actually look like, what's the anatomy of anxiety. So we're going to go into like a web-based 3D brain kind of picture, and any good psychologist needs a good 3D brain picture. And and then we're going to talk a bit about assertiveness training, and anxiety first aid, because what we want to really draw in this webinar is a link between the anatomy and the theories of psychology and your day-to-day experiences. So we're really going to focus on, if you're in sales, if you're in management, and if you're in administration, say in a corporate setting, that assertiveness training is really going to be tailored towards you. And you can definitely apply this to other relationships in your life as well. But we found in those three areas that this training is fantastic. So, and this is all free. There's no charge with this webinar. We're wanting to give you guys the best that we can straight away. And then also going to talk about anxiety first aid as well. There's an amazing offer too that will be emailed to you. So we change our offers all the time. So we're not going to put it in the webinar because we do shift around things quite a lot. So that offer will be coming to you in email as well. Good old Charlie Brown there, picture of my anxieties, having anxieties. Just a fantastic picture with Charlie Brown. So what is anxiety? So couple of really specific pointers here. One is that fear is a normal response to arousal. So fear isn't actually anxiety. Fear is just a normal, oh my gosh, I'm in danger. What's happening? Is there a threat? And it's a perceived or real threat. So it can be just something that you perceived. I don't know if you growing up as a kid, sometimes I was scared of shadows, and it was a perceived threat that there might be a werewolf or something, behind the curtains. But it's just a perceived thing. It's not actually real. I've never actually met a werewolf before, so yeah, I don't think they're real. But now anxiety is a different thing. Anxiety is anticipation of future threats. So anxiety is different to fear in that we're afraid of what's going to happen in the future. So we're kind of future focused, and it very much is a concern about the future. So what if kind of is the big question around anxiety. What if this is going to happen? Or what if that's going to happen? Or what if the world falls over, or the economy falls over. What if there's a terrorist, or what if, and anxiety follows through on some of those things. And there's sort of some of the bigger ones. Some of the symptoms that clients that I've had, and even myself, because all of us suffer anxiety to some different extents, is accelerated heart rate. So there's an accelerated heart rate, and you can actually measure your heart rate if your heart rate's above 100 beats per minute. And if you've got like a Fitbit or a smartwatch, and even if you've got a smartphone, you can actually measure your heart rate using heart rate apps as well, which you can download. And what you're measuring there is that your brain and your body are moving into an automatic response where you're concerned about the future, and your heart rate spikes. And the reason why it spikes is because you're getting a hit of what we call adrenaline. And adrenaline increases your heart rate because it's wanting to increase the oxygen in your body and get you ready for one of three things: a fight, a freeze, or a flight response. So that's getting into a bit more of the anatomy. But what you also can find is that there's a spike in blood pressure. Sometimes people can feel dizzy or fatigue. There's stomach upsets, gastro upsets, that because that adrenaline and cortisol actually comes from the adrenal gland just above your kidneys. It pumps itself into your stomach sometimes, and you can actually feel butterflies in the stomach. Sometimes you can actually be physically ill because, like vomiting, because that gastrointestinal is so strong. There's general aches and pains as well, which can occur because you're getting adrenaline and cortisol into your body, and muscle tension and spasm can occur with sweating as well. So there's just some examples of what happens to our body. I've just done a picture as well of a little boat in a storm with a lighthouse, and the reason why I put that is many of my clients across the years have felt overwhelmed. So anxiety feelings can really connect with feelings of being overwhelmed. And often, I use an analogy of a boat, going through a storm. And the boat, say it's a sailing boat, it's keeling over in the wind. So the wind is pushing that boat over to the side, and it feels like the boat's going to go under. And in Sydney, Australia, that's where we're from here, and this is where the webinar's coming from, is we've got a famous boat race, which is the Sydney to Hobart boat race, which is a little island of Australia called Tasmania. Hobart's its capital. And so it's a famous race which starts on Boxing Day, the day after Christmas Day. And it's notorious for storms. So it's notorious sailing boat, which is dangerous and difficult. And there's an area of Australia called the Bass Strait, which has got all sorts of storms. So if you can imagine you're in this storm and you're feeling overwhelmed and you feel like the boat's going to keel over, that's very much close to how people feel with anxiety. And often it passes, it goes through waves. So the waves can last for 10 minutes or they can last for hours sometimes too. And so that wave of anxiety can flow through you. And that's kind of sort of what anxiety is, because you're concerned about the future. So moving on a little bit more into detail, is anxiety also is in a cultural context. And I want to point you towards a bell curve here. And really, we use a thing called the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual as psychologists. And it's in the 5th version of that particular manual. And the great word around that with the DSM is what we call vigilance. It's sort of like, how is your vigilance at the moment when it comes to general life? And if you're over vigilant, so on the bell curve, if you're sort of pushing out towards that over vigilance area, that might mean that in that particular space you might have anxiety. So when we talk about culturally, some cultures being over vigilant for things isn't actually a big issue. So you might be over vigilant for cleaning your hands and cleaning your equipment and cleaning the things around you. And the culture that might be relevant is the medical culture. So say you're a surgeon, if you're cleaning your hands regularly, that's culturally fine. So you don't have anxiety because you're washing your hands all the time. Now, if you're in another culture where you're just sort of, generically around the house and you're mowing the lawns, but you're washing your hands 10 to 12 times a day, culturally, that might be in the bit more of the abnormal range. So the reason why we're putting this out there is, how's your vigilance and how is it culturally contextualized? So again, if you're under vigilance, so say you're on this bell curve here, and under vigilance can be also a problem as well, is that when you're under vigilant And these are the guys that are up on top of telegraph poles taking selfies and or in front of trains, these sorts of things where they're just not aware of the vigilance that they need to have to stay alive. so that can be an issue as well. And even culturally, that can be an issue. So, taking risks which are unnecessary can be very dangerous as well. So, I read a story last week of a girl who was on a round the world trip that did a jump from a massive bridge and passed away because she just wasn't aware of the dangers of jumping off a very high bridge into the water, and which is a really sad thought. But it's sort of being aware of in that mid range is kind of where we want to be, in that kind of normal range when it comes to anxiety. So we don't want to be over vigilant, don't want to be under vigilant. We want to kind of have a bit more of a balanced life, and that's really the theme of this particular whole course, is actually balance and finding that balance and resilience with the anxiety as well. So some of the common diagnoses with anxiety include specific phobias, so fears about certain things, so specific things that occur. Panic attacks are quite regular. We actually regularly get clients that have panic attacks, and the panic attacks can be all sorts of range of things. Sometimes they're shame related. We often get panic attacks when people feel ashamed of things. They feel shame about what they've done or what they've perceived to have done, and sometimes the fear that's inside them can be so great, and the fear of the future can be so great that creates a panic attack. And really, a panic attack is afraid of being afraid. So it sort of forms a spiral that, when someone's afraid, they actually start getting afraid of being afraid, which then starts sort of forming a little bit of a mini tornado, which then, creates that panic attack, which is sort of what we're talking about. And probably the most common thing that we see in sessions is what we call generalized anxiety disorder, where anxiety builds up across time and sort of layers with people. And so layer up a layer of anxiety sort of builds up. And then it gets to a point where sometimes we're not sure what we're anxious about, and that there's just a general anxiety occurring across the spaces. Now, anxiety also overlaps with many other mental health conditions, and depression's sort of a common one with anxiety, and it's probably the most common in therapy settings though. So there might be what we call a comorbidity, where you actually have anxiety connected to depression, or anxiety connected to obsessive compulsive disorder, or anxiety connected to like a relationship breakdown or something like that, and that's a pretty common thing that occurs as well. So just letting you know that anxiety really is, I'd say, probably a good 70% of our bread and butter as psychologists, of treating people with anxiety. And so it's probably one of our first courses. It is our first course here at Education for Life, and we sort of talk a little bit about that. So we're going to talk about right now is just the anatomy of anxiety, and what I'm going to do is just crack into a link, and this particular link, I'll just get out of my MailChimp. It's called 3D Brain, so I'll just bring it up. And where are we here? Here we go. And what we're going to talk about with the anatomy of anxiety is really get into the detail. I'm just going to wait till this loads itself up. Getting into the detail of actually how does the brain look with anxiety. So we're just going to, this should load up reasonably quick. So I'll give you a bit of an analogy here. Is that there's two major parts to the brain, and just as it loads up, I'll show you, is that we've got sort of the big cortex part of the brain here, okay? And that's actually sort of really our higher functioning. The second part of our brain is what we call the midbrain, and the midbrain is in this middle part of the brain here, hence the midbrain. And it also includes the brainstem here. Third major part to the brain is the cerebellum, but the two major that we're looking after with anxiety and the anatomy of anxiety are these two parts of the brain here. So the cortex itself creates a map of what we perceive reality to be. So all the different lobes have different functions, but the overall function of the cortex, which is really higher functioning, is to create a map of what we think reality is. Now, in the planet as well, we've got one of the biggest cortexes in the planet, apart from dolphins. So dolphins have actually got a bigger cortex than us. I don't necessarily believe in swimming with dolphins though, so just letting you know with that one there. So really what we're looking at with the cortex, and probably the major one that we look at, is really the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is looking after what we call executive functioning. So higher functioning, logic, A plus B equals C, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Very much we term the Western world is very frontal lobian. It's very logic orientated or education oriented. And so when we get education into our brain, it's really going through the frontal lobe, and it's processing through the frontal lobe, and we're making executive decisions out of that. So our will, our choices, a lot of intelligence, what we call crystallized intelligence. I remember at university learning about crystallized intelligence, is all part of the frontal lobe. It's all part of that logical sequencing part of the brain. Now, where anxiety actually lives is in the midbrain. And in the midbrain, very much, and this is quite general, but it's basically creating a map of what we call safety and security. So if you can think safety and security with the midbrain, and that's semi-conscious or subconscious. It's not always, at the surface of what we're thinking. Often the frontal lobe is kind of where we're thinking, but the midbrain's sort of in the background all the time, scanning, am I safe, am I secure? Now, what we want to focus on here in the limbic system, and we'll just load this up, is what we call the amygdala. And the amygdala is basically a part of the brain that stores information relating to that fear. So we're kind of created with two basic fears in life. One is a fear of falling, and the other is a fear of loud noises. Now, my wife and I have twins. We have, younger twins. They're around 18 months now. And so if you throw the twin up in the air, they're going to be freaking out because they've got that fear of falling. But then you catch them, and it's sort of like a game that we can play with babies, that we, throw them up in the air safely, but then catch them, and then they squeal with delight because they just enjoy that rush of energy that they're getting. So that's a fear of falling. Now, the other thing is a fear of loud noises. So when you clap loudly near a baby, it's what we call a startle response. And that startle response will, basically startle a kid. Now, every other fear that we have is learned. Now, if you can think, in that particular amygdala are stores of many, many, many fears. And the reason, and some of those fears that we deliberately teach our kids. So, for example, with our children, we're teaching our kids to be afraid of traffic because cars are dangerous. So hold mum and dad's hand when we're crossing a road, or hold mum and dad's hand when we're anywhere near loud noises of traffic. It's a whole new world now with these electric cars as well, because you can't hear them as much. And so there's a whole things as parents that we're learning as well. And we're sort of deliberately teaching fear to our kids in a positive way, in a good way. And so these fears are very much related to everyday life. So fears of hot stoves, fears of spiders, like here in Sydney, Australia, we have a thing called a funnel web spider, which is extremely deadly. No one's actually died from a funnel web bite for many, many years. Like, we're talking over 15, 20 years. So, they are deadly, but they've got lots of anti-venom and stuff. So that, hopefully, if you come to Australia, we'd love you to come. Don't worry too much about funnel webs. And hopefully that alleviates your anxiety a little bit. But the point I'm trying to make is that anxiety and fear stores itself in the amygdala. Now, when and this is getting to the anatomy of anxiety, is that when the amygdala fires, so when it perceives there's danger, the amygdala then goes through what we call an HPA schedule, and that's what we've got in the slideshow here, is that in the HPA schedule, we actually have, where are we here? Hypothalamus gets triggered from the amygdala, which then talks to the pituitary gland, which is just that little dangly thing just at the front, just there, of the midbrain region. And then that sends some information just down the brainstem here to just above our kidneys to the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands pump adrenaline and cortisol into our body. And that schedule, the HPA schedule, is pretty much the thing that fuels our fight, freeze and flight response. So I want to use a bit of an analogy here, and hopefully you're still tracking okay and the attention's okay, because this very much underpins anxiety. And if you can understand the science behind what's going on here, it really can explain your everyday anxiety situations. And this is sort of some of the information that we find ourselves in therapy repeating regularly to clients. Because if you can understand that this science of what's going on inside your brain and your body is a regular schedule, you can start managing it. You can start managing it and overcoming it. And hopefully there's some light bulbs going on at the moment right now, is that if you can see the schedule of the HPA schedule occurring and sort of preempt it a little bit, you can actually start managing your anxiety in a much more effective way. So there you go. Just hopefully a nugget there that can help you straight away. So what we do, just the analogy is, just imagine there's a lion, like a hungry lion, standing in your room right now, and it wants to eat you. So if you're on a bus or on a train, the lion's right there with you, and just imaginary. And what happens is the amygdala actually starts to fire that there's danger before the occipital lobe, which is right back here, actually picks up that there's any danger in the space, and even before the frontal lobe works out any sort of decision-making capacity. So within about 15 seconds, the amygdala fires and says, look, we need some energy, and we need some oxygen, and we need some basically adrenaline to get us going into a response. So what will happen is that HPA, so hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal gland, will happen, and we'll actually get ready to fight the lion. So if we're moving into a fight response, then we'll attack the lion, rip its head off, take on the lion. I don't know too many people that would take a lion on, but you can give it a crack. The second response, which is probably a more common one, is what we call a freeze response. So we'll actually freeze to the lion. We'll just pretend to play dead, and then hopefully the lion will think that we're not really worth eating, and then walk off and go towards somebody else. The next response could be what we call a flight response, where we'll actually use that adrenaline and cortisol to run as fast as we can away from the lion, and then that's forms what we call a flight response. Now, these three responses underpin or kind of are what we see anxiety to be. So we actually see these three responses occurring, and then that's actually what we call anxiety. So we see the behaviors of these responses, and we go, okay, that's a fight response. Okay, we see someone getting angry, and that's actually a fight response. And I remember many years ago doing a marriage training seminar, and the person that was teaching us was saying, if you've got an angry spouse, you've got an anxious spouse. And I was immediately thinking, wow, that's fascinating, because there must be some area that someone's getting angry about, and that's normally an anxiety response. So just a thought there, hopefully another nugget there too. A freeze response is sort of really common when it comes to abuse situations. So if someone's had abuse and they've been imprinted into their amygdala through abuse. So normally with abuse, we talk about someone more powerful and someone less powerful. So that actually then creates a freeze response. So that can happen in a workplace situation. So if you grew up and there might have been a bit of an abusive situation with verbal abuse, so emotional and verbal abuse growing up in your household, then when you're in a management situation and you're being managed by somebody who can be aggressive, then you might move into a freeze response. So you don't know what to say, you don't know what to do. And this is what we're going to get onto with the assertiveness training, is that these responses can be retrained. So we might have grown up in all sorts of different situations which have imprinted themselves in this amygdala. And those imprints are actually then what governs the anxiety responses that we have. And this is where we go into the whole realm of what we call cognitive behavior therapy, which is what our course goes through, is that we try and detail what are some of these imprints that happen in the amygdala, which has then caused your responses, your fight, your freeze and your flight responses, and then how can we retrain this part of the brain practically, so then that way when you move into that situation again, so say you go into a management situation again and you're being managed by someone who is aggressive, then you don't go into a freeze response. You're able to be assertive and explain your side of the situation with confidence and with a bit more ease because of you working through some of these issues. So that's where the neuroscience connects with the practical side of life, and this is really what our course at Education for Life is going through and goes through. So yeah, just pointing that out really clearly and succinctly there. So so on that note, what we're going to do is get into a bit of assertiveness training, and then we're going to move into a bit of anxiety first aid. So with the assertiveness training, and I'll just put this